So welcome everybody. My name is Thea. I am the Policy Director at Civil Rights Corps, which is a nonprofit organization based out of Washington, DC. And I'm extremely pleased to say that we have two amazing panelists here today. We have State Senator Robert Peters from Illinois, and we have State Representative Lindsay Sabadosa from Massachusetts. And the context for this panel is that really at no point in our history has the need to completely reimagine what safety is in this country been greater. Also, perhaps at no point in our history have the headwinds been so challenging from advancing some of these reforms. Non-carceral crisis response in this context is both something that is extremely important in this drive to reimagine safety, and it's also a case study of how we advance this much broader project. And so for all of those reasons, just really excited to dig in and see what everyone can learn about how to get these sorts of programs going in your state. And then also really what comes next in this much broader campaign to dismantle the criminal legal injustice that we are all so aware of and figure out systems that will truly keep families and communities safe. So with that as context, let me go ahead and start with my first question, which is really the why here. So could you each just explain in your own words, why did this particular issue capture you? And what do you see as the political opening for non-carceral approaches to crisis response, even in this particular political climate? So Senator Peters, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. So I think the first part is, when it comes to having a non-carceral approach, it's about safety. I think oftentimes we don't talk about it in the lens of safety, but it's very much safety, especially when it comes to mental health and addiction and people's well-being. We have gone through decades of basically the defunding of social services and then put that all on the backs of law enforcement to respond to a series of crises. And I've had personal interactions. My mom, she struggled with her own mental health issues and actually once called the cops on me to do something around medication. And that was one of the most frightening experiences because I was adopted into a white Irish Catholic household, and my mom was white, and I was this Black kid, and interacting with the cops around something that was a mental health situation for a variety of different degrees was actually very frightening. And then the other one is literally hearing from people in the community who've had to experience a ton of trauma, or people who've lost a life literally being murdered. And so, I was the lead sponsor of a bill that we call CESSA, originally called the Watts Act, which was named after a kid who was in the south suburbs of Chicago. He struggled with a lot of mental health trauma. His dad calls the cops, says, do not bring multiple cops. If you can, bring one person. He's really going through a traumatic experience. He was locked in his basement. He's locked in his bathroom. He comes out with like a butter knife, and he gets shot and killed and murdered, which led to a whole movement, organized movement that led to the creation of mental health first responders. And last year, myself and the state rep, along with these organizers, ended up passing a mental health first responder bill aligned with 988 that goes into effect next year. And the idea is that the police are not allowed to engage. They can at least be nearby. We did that as an agreement. They can be, but not visibly engaged when it comes to something like a mental health traumatic experience and certain other experiences around addiction and behavioral health. That is something we are hoping to have go into effect next year. But as was said, there's been a lot of political headwinds against it. And the bill is called CESSA. I don't have the bill number. I will make sure that everybody knows it. It's called CESSA in Illinois. But a lot of this is both something that you see is the fact that this is all, I'm going to stop talking for so long, but this is the idea that we closed down mental health facilities here in Chicago that was under Rahm Emanuel, 12 of them. And in replacement of that was an increase in incarceration. And it just literally puts people in dangerous situations that don't actually lift them up. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for that answer. And just one thing that really struck me is The word defund gets a lot of attention, right? Because the conversation is about should we defund the police, but what we're not talking about is the defunding that we did of our social welfare state back in the 1980s and the 1990s. And it's really that defunding that is causing so many of the issues that we're seeing here today. So that definitely struck me. Representative Sabadosa, would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really thrilled to be talking about something that I think about on a daily basis. And my story as to how I came into this work is a little bit different. I'm a mom, I have a 15-year-old, but really, I think my inspiration was years ago. I was taking my daughter to the YMCA, as we often do, to go swimming. And there was a child in the parking lot who was having a breakdown. And, as a parent, you recognize meltdowns, and then there are meltdowns that are a little more serious. And this was a little bit more serious. I don't know the child's history, but I do know that the parents were not able to control the situation. Members of the Y came out and tried to help, and eventually they ended up calling the police. This child was maybe 6 or 7, and I remember thinking that it was horrible that the only solution we had at that moment was to call a police officer. We call police when bad things happen, when there are scary things. That's not the right response to a kid who's having a meltdown and who really just needed some support and whose parents needed some support. And so I started doing research, as I'd like to do. And then when I was elected to office, I did a lot more. And I understood that we do actually have crisis response in Massachusetts, but it's just, whether you can use it or not is determined based on your health insurance. I know no parent who is going to pull out their health insurance card to check whether that's accepted at the crisis response unit to figure out if they can get their kid help. And so I think, much like Senator Peters said, it all defaults to the police. So we started working with NASW, the National Association of Social Workers, Massachusetts chapter, and many others, as we wanted to figure out what can we do that is not just insurance-based and where we can have a response in the community. Massachusetts does a lot of work around co-response, which is where you have a social worker or a behavioral health specialist showing up with a police officer. In fact, we're investing about another $11 million in the budget this year, and it's run through our Department of Mental Health. But what we've often heard is that it's not always the right approach, because you often have police officers who want to lead that situation, and they do not let the behavioral health specialist really have much of a say. And I will personally say, when I talk to individuals who need those services, they talk about peer support, peer specialists actually being the most useful party who can show up and make a real change in the situation. So we filed something that we call the ACES bill, Alternative Community Emergency Services. And it's a very simple bill. It does not try to dictate what this program should look like. It offers lots of suggestions. It is essentially a grant funding program. And we were able to file this in response to some of the federal work that has been done, because states can apply for money to develop these programs through an 1115 waiver, which Massachusetts has applied for. We have a behavioral health roadmap. And I think, as Senator Peters said, it falls really nicely within the 988 work that's being done. But we wanted to set up a program where we were allowing communities to figure out what works best for them. Massachusetts is very urban, and it's also very rural. And we need something that works in a big city of 2 million people and in a small town of 600. And there is no one size fits all for that kind of work. So the most important thing to us was that those grants were being issued by people who understood what the work should look like, and not just by law enforcement. So we still have not passed that legislation, but we have, sort of through a back door in the budget, been able to create a program that's called Equitable Approaches to Public Safety. It's run through the Department of Public Health, and it does fund communities that are looking to set up these programs. It's very small right now. We have 11 communities that applied, 5 that were funded, and we're very slowly trying to prove that this is a model that works, because the headwinds are very strong. And while 2 years ago, everyone was very excited to talk about defunding and talking about how we create alternatives, that needle has spun back to the other side. And what we hear more often than not is we need to protect our police. And that's even in Massachusetts, which is generally considered a pretty progressive state. So we're trying to do very small things to get to a point where we can, when that needle comes back to our side, pass some really significant legislation.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that answer. And when you brought up the specifics of your legislation, as well as the differences between co-response versus kind of fully non-carceral, it, I think, provided a nice segue to this next question, which is for the folks on here who are a bit more in the weeds of having to really design bills that are going to advance these policies. I was wondering if you could give 1 or 2 pieces of advice on features of the bill that you think are most important. And then happy to chime in afterwards with some of what we've heard from some of the advocates that we work with. So why don't let's start with Senator Peters again.
Yeah, so I think, so 1 or 2 pieces of advice. I think the first one is 988 was really helpful. I just have to say how important it was that 988 happened at the federal level, because we made it so that in Illinois, we have different operators and different emergency management systems and regions. And the way we're doing this is that you would call 911, and then it would immediately have to coordinate with 988, creating a non-carceral response to a mental or behavioral health crisis situation. And that made it easier for us to be able to move the bill, because we could explain to people, you call 911, you just need to make it so it works with 988, not have it be separate, which is too often what happens. That's one. The second one is avoiding a co-responder model as much as possible. The amount of times people tried to say a co-responder model, and the best way to do that was literally having people who were directly impacted. We had the Watts family talking to everyone. We had a grassroots organizations that were doing, literally led by disability justice movement advocates in the state, talking to everyone to say how they do not want to have to engage with police if they were going through some crisis, and how that would make that a dangerous situation for them. So to me, those 2 things mattered. Highlighting 988 and saying that this is actually going to work in tandem with 988 and do the work of 988 and respond to people in immediate crisis, and highlighting that the directly impacted do not want to have a co-responder model, that they are speaking up, not just me, the legislator, not just policy people, but specifically an organized group. And in Illinois, I want to give a shout out to Access Living, who I remember when they brought me this bill, and they had a cohort of people on a variety of different planes in terms of disabilities and how that's impacting their life, who spoke up and said, this is our main focus in terms of this criminal justice fight, who looked at the crisis that came out of the George Floyd protest, but we weren't able to get it done in our veto session, which is in January. We ended up getting this done in May, and understood the flexibility of having an argument around the 988 piece and the directly impacted piece. So those are things I think are just so vitally important.
Absolutely. And I want to just lift up a question that I just answered in the chat, because I think it resonates with what you're just saying. So there's a question about, what does non-carceral mean? And the answer is, non-carceral means not connected at all to the criminal legal system. And that's really at the crux of what Senator Peters was just saying, and was really the biggest thing I was going to uplift that I've heard from advocates across the country, which is that there is a tendency to think of crisis response as still something that should have law enforcement be involved, whether that's because you have both a mental health trained professional and a police officer, or training police officers. But really what the demand is here, and what Senator Peters was just uplifting, is the need for systems that are truly independent of that apparatus.
I'll end with just one point. I think, and just now finish there. There's an inherent contradiction that police don't want to actually be doing this work, but also feel like they need to do it to protect their funding. It's a point where it's almost like, it's ridiculous, to be honest with you, and it drives me nuts, because they don't want to actually be doing so much of this health work. They just want a lot in terms of the funding, and there's this protective reaction to it. But also knowing that they don't want to do this work is something that also works to sell to people in the legislature and to stakeholders. And that just, to me, again, was just so vitally important. But okay, I'm going to stop talking.
No, this is great. Representative Sabadosa, would love your thoughts.
Yeah, I just, in listening to all of this, it really does make me think one of the headwinds that we're also facing in Massachusetts is the fact that we it sounds unlike Illinois. We went in a slightly different direction after the George Floyd protest, and we did a very massive police reform bill. Now, everyone can criticize it as not having gone far enough, but it does put in standards of training and commissions and ways to decertify. And we got enormous pushback for doing it. And that still has a ripple effect today. So the conversation about funding and fear of change are very, very real right now. And I think it's making it a little harder for us to move away from that co-response movement and to take the momentum that 988 is giving us and use that to make change. So this is why I think we're doing these sort of smaller backdoor programs that don't really sound like they're doing a lot, and yet we're able to do that work with the administration and less on the like splashy legislative front. The other thing I think I'd like to lift up from what I heard and the question about what are some of the lessons, the coalition building is extremely important. And I heard Senator Peters saying that our coalition for the ACEs bill includes, I mentioned the social workers, but peer response groups, disability rights advocates, prison reform advocates, and they all come from unions are involved. They all come from slightly different places. It's been really interesting with the unions who are like, yes, we don't want co-response. Also, our members make money from co-response. So we have to take a position that's maybe a little counter to what is actually benefiting our members. But they also are able to lift up other issues that I don't think we necessarily would have thought of. Like I said, we came into this work talking very much about how do we make sure police are not the default in these responses, but they've lifted up, sometimes you don't want the Department of Children and Families involved in these cases. The way we respond to domestic violence is atrocious, and it victimizes everybody, like right across the board. It doesn't matter. Anybody in that household where domestic violence occurred some way suffers from the way that we respond to that situation. So I think it's been important for us to hear that the problems run so much deeper than just simply having the right person show up, because you don't want, I don't want to be too wonky about Massachusetts politics, but you don't necessarily want to have someone committed for substance abuse, like put into in Massachusetts, unfortunately, it's a jail where we put people if they have substance abuse against their will, or put into a mental health hospital against their will. And those are also harms that are done in the community. So the coalition being extraordinarily broad brings all those things up. And there are no easy answers, right? Like we're talking about major system reform, but it does sort of help us as we're taking each step to try to do the least amount of harm with change as possible, which is unfortunately there's always going to be some harm caused by a policy change, and we just need to try to minimize it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a lot there. And, one other piece to just add to this conversation about who is actually providing these particular services is to also think through any restrictions around grantees if you are setting up a grant program for these services. This is something that I've heard again and again from a lot of the grassroots advocates who are pushing for these changes, is that sometimes they will spend years, right, in the sand fighting to make these programs happen, and then they can't actually benefit because the language and how those programs are administered cut out a lot of the smaller organizations, the truly community-based advocates and providers. And, there's a lot there, and a lot of it gets a little bit wonky, but I would just really urge everyone to think pretty critically about that in legislative design, because again, this really is an issue that is just playing out in communities across the country. So with that being said, would love to turn the conversation just a little bit to think a bit more about strategy. And I think Representative Sabadosa, you actually started this off, so I might, go back to you first. You're talking a bit about the power of building diverse coalitions in terms of the different groups at the table. But I was just curious if each of you could share either just like one strategic takeaway you would love to impart with everybody, or a particular challenge that you encountered and were able to overcome, and then just kind of a word about how you're able to do so.
And I get to go first for the hard question. Well, I guess I'll say with the broad coalition, one of the things that's been really helpful is we've been able to identify different vehicles. And so we have really focused on how do we get bits and pieces of this implemented, and then how do we engage on a municipal level as well. I really appreciate you bringing up that sometimes the small organizations that are doing the work don't get this funding. And I think that's often by virtue of the fact that the grants have to go through municipalities or they have to go through a certain agency, and God help anybody who has to do grant writing. That's not easy. These applications are challenging. And so we've been trying to figure out ways where not only are we pushing for the legislation on the state level, but we're also doing organizing within the communities so that we can get those small organizations sort of pushed up the ladder and working with the municipality. My community has decided to do something totally different, which is interesting. They're creating their own department within the city. So then it was a question not of getting the right organization in there. We only had very large organizations that, quite honestly, you wouldn't want to be running this program, but it was getting the right people hired for those positions and doing a lot of that advocacy work. I fully believe that legislating, like the easy part is almost passing the bill, which is laughable because passing bills is really hard, but it's the implementation of the bill once you've passed it that is the actual work, and you need to watchdog that. And so that's where we've been spending a lot of time getting the right people at the table, the right people hired for those positions, and making sure that even if it's slow, it's moving in the right direction.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I see some vigorous head nodding. So
Yeah, so I mean, I come out of community organizing, and like that's something I did for quite some time before I became a state senator, and I actually helped start a coalition called the End Money Bond Coalition, and so when it came to, so we ended the money bond in Illinois that goes into effect on January 1st. That came out, we did that in January. We created CESSA. That's in May. These are all there's an intentional thing that happens with every bill that I carry in coalition with people, which is the implementation dates, because I think the rep is correct. Implementation is actually the hardest part of the entire process because a lot of shenanigans can happen. You can get focused on other things. People might not have capacity. And so if you take so when we think about these things, I tend to do this extended implementation date of January 1st of a year or year and a half or 2 years later, with the intention of making sure that we have proper implementation, proper oversight of implementation, and making sure that organizations that were involved are part of the implementation process. So when I think about how we ended cash bail, making sure that the public defender's office is involved, making sure that organizations that look over courts are involved, making sure that people who were directly impacted in terms of pretrial are involved and EM are involved. If you look at CESSA, making sure that disability justice advocates are involved. So in the structure of CESSA, we have regional task force, like a regional task force and a statewide task force. And the idea is actually there's a lot of power in the regional task force, not the statewide, and making sure that people who are directly involved in the creation of the legislation are involved in the regional task force. And then another thing that when I think about these coalitions, not just as a state senator, but as an organizer, is thinking about you have one organization that can do direct action and, excuse my language, fuck up some shit through some direct action. You have another organization that does electoral organizing because you want to have that political pressure. Then you have another organization that is really good at the narrative work, building narrative work. So media and making sure you get as much earned media as possible and making sure that you can frame your message and respond to your message because you're limited in power. And then the other one is, now that I'm in a position of governing power, is having someone who organizes alongside me. So yes, I'm going to say this, a lobbyist who cares about your work and is going to do what I call under the dome organizing. So we have someone who worked alongside with me, for almost any bill. I try to say I want someone who can do the roll calling to help get this done. And so those things and creating that coalition means you have a variety of different tactics to actually sort of go at the policy problem. And when you put something in place, the ability to respond, as the rep said, to basically responding and saying whatever you're doing is causing so many problems, and you're this person who it was supposed to be a mental health response, and maybe a social worker experiences some trouble. Therefore, that's why we need to have cops, and being able to respond quickly to those stories is important and key to a coalition. Or whether it's another criminal justice piece, I think just coming out of the reaction to George Floyd, it's not just about what you pass and implement, but also defend. So yeah, I think the broad coalition building with a variety of different tactics, and also having people who are willing to do the nitty gritty direct action or confrontational or tension-based work is actually really helpful.
Amazing. So you could give a masterclass on organizing tactics. Thank you so much, Senator Peters. I know we're up at time here, so I just want to do this as a lightning round. So the last question was just what next? And I just wonder if you just say in a sentence, what is your next priority once non-carceral crisis response is really up and running? And would just note, I did share a little resource in the chat here, which are 8 policy ideas for state lawmakers that my organization came up with. So let's go ahead and start with you, Representative Sabadosa.
So once we have a non-carceral community emergency response throughout Massachusetts, I think really the next solution, the next step is to figure out what you do after that emergency response, right? A lot of times people need places to go. They need respite. They need housing. They need connections to services where they don't feel like they're being re-traumatized. That is an enormous next piece of the puzzle, but that's the next step.
Great.
I mean, to me, the next step to me is, I say this professionalization in a formal manner. So like oftentimes these are left to nonprofits who struggle with funding. And depending on where you're at, particularly if you're in a rural community, that is extremely difficult. Even if you get some state funding or you get federal funding or you get private money, it is extremely difficult. And to me, it's bringing that stuff back in-house into DHS and Department of Mental Health, bringing those in there and professionalizing it. I also think we have to fundamentally continue to shift how we view public safety. As the rep said, it's making sure that you have good housing, making sure you can get to point A, point B, making sure that you have a good union job and that people are able to access a job and have real power, making sure that people have a good school, and making sure that we keep people in that house and we don't actually break up families, which we've done too long. So I think that those things and strengthening those and making sure that they're tied down deeply to community is an important next step. And we can do bits and pieces of that over the long haul to build up that movement from the grassroots to governing.
That's great. And I would just kind of close by saying that the one thing I would leave folks with is that we also need institutions to match everything that both of our panelists were just saying. You know, if all of these programs are being run by the Department of Justice or by police departments, we don't have a paradigm shift, right? We need a division of community safety that is truly non-carceral. They can oversee these programs, and let's keep them accountable. At the local level, let's have real alternatives to police. Let's have community safety agencies that are, again, totally disconnected. So we just say that who's administering these programs also makes all the difference in the world. All right, that's all we have. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to everybody for being here, and have a great rest of your conference.
Thank you.